Meet Daniel. He's been with the company for 12 years. Quiet, reliable, always does the right thing, until the day he didn't. Nobody noticed the drafted resignation letter that he never sent. There's no end in sight to the late nights that he keeps working and weekends to keep the system running. He's got access to everything: production systems, shared secrets, service accounts that haven't been rotated in far too long. And he didn't hack the system. He just used it the way it was built, with a little too much trust baked in. You see, this isn't a talk about hackers in hoodies. It's about a far more real threat: insiders, legacy assumptions, and systems that trust just a little too hard. This is because in a distributed system where identities and services can span environments, clouds, continents, trust isn't a feature, it's a bug. My name is William, and let's talk about how to address that. But first, a disclaimer. You may think with the title of the talk that I am a cat person. I am not a cat person. Now, for those of you that are dog people in the room, don't get too excited, because I'm not a dog person either. I don't think it's fair to limit myself to one kind of animal. In fact, if the animal wants to give me affection, it wants to play with me, I can have snuggles with it and cuddle it. That's the kind of animal person that I am. So whether that's a cat or a dog or a guinea pig or a parrot or a goat or a cow or a chicken, those are the kind of animals that I like. In fact, when I was growing up, my grandparents had a farm, and on that farm there was a cow, E-I-E-I-O, and I used to call this cow Bessie, probably because I think her name was Bessie. And she was my favorite cow, because every morning me and my cousins would go out into the livestock area and we'd go and play with her. We'd take her hay as a treat, or a little seed pod that she'd love to eat. In fact, I used to play fetch with Bessie. So I would take a little seed pod and show it to her in front of her face, and then I would throw it. And I swear every word of this is true. So I would throw the seed pod for her and she would ignore it. But when I went to go fetch a seed pod, she'd walk along next to me, nuzzling up against me, give me more affection. Which I guess is all a really long-winded way of saying that I do like cats, but also other animals. Now, security is a big topic, and there's a lot of consultants that make a lot of money helping people improve the security of their systems. The specific area that I can help you in is systems that are based off of messaging. Now, because it's a big topic, I do want to tell you what I'm not going to cover in this talk. Those are going to be dog things. And then I'm going to tell you what I am going to cover in this talk, the cat things. So that if you sit here and you realize that I'm not going to cover what you want me to cover, you don't have to spend 45 minutes waiting to find out. You can go to another session and get some more value out of it that way. The things that I'm not covering are authentication. I'm going to assume that you've got authentication as a solved problem in your system. You've got some way of identifying that a user is who they say they are, and they can present your site with a token or a credential or a claim or something. I'm also not going to cover anything to do with TLS encryption. I'm going to assume you've got that set up already. That should be a bare minimum when you're talking about security. We're not going to cover token exchanges either. We will cover why you might want to do token exchanges, but not how to do them, because that's very technology specific and it depends on what you're using to issue those tokens in your system. I'm also not going to cover how to secure your databases or your file shares or anything like that. It's not a particularly interesting topic for me, and there's people that are better skilled to be able to do that for you as well. And I'm not going to cover anything to do with front-end security. What I will be covering, though, is we'll cover tracking identity, why it's important, and we'll look at a few different ways that you can do that within a system that's based on messaging. We'll also look at the basics of zero trust in messaging systems. At its heart, this is a talk based on zero trust. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about zero trust and what it means for your messaging systems. We'll also take a look at personalization of data from a security perspective as well. And then we'll look at token expiration, so what to do when the tokens that you are using to identify your users expire. We'll also look at how to version the security rules within your application. And then, because I know at least some of you are here for it, there will be plenty of cat memes along the way. So don't worry, they're coming. Before that, though, I just want to introduce you to the inspiration for this talk. This is my cat, Butterbean. Everybody calls him Butt, not because that's short for Butterbean, but because he's an asshole. He doesn't like anybody except my daughter, so I can safely say he doesn't like anybody in this room because she's not here. And he's the inspiration for this talk, because when you start working with zero trust, you need to assume that everybody that's in your environment is out to make your life miserable. That is this creature. He tries everything he can to make my life miserable. Let's get into the security. So a modular monolith. What is a modular monolith? A modular monolith is a way of developing applications that exists on a spectrum of deployability or deployness. That's a real word that I've just made up now. Where on the one end of the spectrum, you might have a monolith. Not a modular monolith, but a monolith. And that is where everything is deployed within one application, maybe two applications. It might be a web application and an application server. But most of the code exists within the application. Now, this is nice from a development perspective, because you only have to check one repository out, open it up in your IDE, and you can start mashing buttons and working on the thing. And at the start of the system, you can feel really productive. The downside to this, though, is that because everything is in process, you can call code directly. So part of the system can call other parts of the system and invoke methods directly. This has a high likelihood of introducing coupling within the components of your system. And eventually, once you start supporting the system for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, the coupling that you're going to have is going to be so tight that you're going to be working with a very brittle system. At this stage, we call this a ball of mud. And it's not a pleasant experience to work with after a while. On the other end of the spectrum, we might have something like microservices, where every bit of capability that your system exposes is deployed as its own separate process. This addresses the problem of coupling, because you can't call another microservice from a microservice directly. You have to communicate typically via messaging. So you would send a message and hope that that message gets processed at some point. So this addresses the coupling part. But the development experience is terrible, because you might have to open up 5 processes, 10, 50, just to get your system running. Now, in production, it's not too much of a problem, because you've got a lot of monitoring tools that you can use to see that everything is working the way it's supposed to work. But when you're developing on this, it's awful. So a modular monolith is an attempt at compromise between the two. It tries to take the best parts of both of these approaches. So we say, well, in the modular monolith, everything is going to be one process. It's going to be one application. But we're going to have some rules. Any capability that we have in our modular monolith, we're going to keep constrained to a module. Inside the module, the code in that module can call other code directly, but if the code ever needs to go outside of that module, it has to do so via placing a message on an implementation of the mediator pattern. So it'll create a message, stick it on the mediator bus, and the mediator bus will invoke wherever that message needs to go. So this is an attempt to keep the development experience nice, but also prevent coupling, accidental coupling that gets added later on. The benefit of this is that if we decide we want to take a capability of our application and we want to extract it out for whatever reason, we can take the module, deploy it in a separate process. The rest of the modules that remain behind don't even need to know that this process or this module has moved to a separate application. When module A sends a message, the mediator bus will say, oh, this message needs to go to module B and module C. Module B is still in process, so I'm going to invoke it directly, but module C is out of process. So what I'm going to do is we're going to introduce a message broker, and we'll put the message on the message broker, and then it goes to module C. The modules themselves don't know that anything has changed. Everything is encapsulated within the mediator bus. It knows that this is out of process, so I'm going to serialize the message and put it on a broker. I think we could all agree that this is exactly the same as getting kittens, right? Allow me to explain why. When you get a cat, you don't deploy the cat into an app domain. That would be foolish. Instead, you deploy the cat into a safe room in your house, and you keep it there for a week, 2 weeks, somewhere around about there, so the cat can get comfortable with your house. You don't interact with the cat via an API gateway. You give it a name, and you talk to the cat. And instead of modules in the room, you've got capabilities that you're exposing the cat to. You've got toys for the cat to play with. You've got food for the cat to eat. You've got a litter box for the cat to do the other half of eating. And the cat doesn't interact with these capabilities via mediator bus. It interacts with them via play, scritching, eating, having fun. Eventually, as time goes on, it's been a week to 10 days to 2 weeks, somewhere around about there, you can start taking some of these capabilities from your room and you can deploy them in other parts of your house. So you can take the litter box and move it into a separate room. You can do the same with the food, and eventually the cat can have the whole rest of the house that it can play with. I think we can all agree I've conclusively proven that software development is like raising cats. I will not be taking any questions on this at this time. I do have sympathy now for project managers when they say that working with developers is like herding cats, because it's objectively true now. So let's let our monolith out and see what it does for security. So we've got our modular monolith, and we're working here, everything's happy. The way that a user interacts with the system is that they present some token, some form of identity to the system. Maybe it's a JOT token. They come with a JOT token and they say, this is who I am, here's the proof that I am who I say I am. And then the system can then go and say, okay, everyone, any bit of code that I invoke now is being invoked by William. And a lot of frameworks that would allow you to do this on the current thread. They'll say the current thread is being executed by William. So you can just go and look at the current thread and see who the principal was that is executing that code. While everything is in process, this is fine. But as soon as we take a module and we move it out into its own separate process, we lose that link. Because when module A creates a message and it puts the message on the mediator bus, and the mediator bus puts it on the broker, and it ends up at module C isn't running in the same thread as the rest of the application. So we need a way of projecting that identity across. Now, thankfully, what we can do is we can just include the token or the user ID as part of the message that we send. This could be as simple as taking our message, charge credit card, for instance, and appending a user ID to it. That could work. And in fact, this is probably sufficient for a lot of cases. We will circle back to this in a few minutes and see why just a user ID might not be sufficient. But the benefits of including the user identity as part of the message are profound, because it means that not only is the intent of the message more clear, your code doesn't have to go and look at context to find out who triggered this message, but also when you have to take a module and extract it out, you don't then have to refactor a bunch of code to include the identity at that stage. So while you develop in your modular monolith, even if it's still going to be a monolith and you've got no intention of ever extracting parts and scaling them out, include the user identity as part of your messages. For Butt, sleeping is an activity that involves people. He doesn't ever want to sleep alone. His favorite place is to sleep on my daughter's chest like this. But if she's not available, he'll settle for someone else. So if she's at school or if she's in her bed, he'll be okay with sleeping on someone else's chest. For him, sleep is an activity that always has an identity. And when you develop in your systems, before you send messages off, include some sort of identity in the message so that when you send it across, you know who triggered that message. And this is one of the only ones in this talk where I'm going to recommend everybody do this, even if you're not going to scale your system out. All of the other techniques that we're going to cover are situational. Let's start looking at them. Authorization. So authorization is William allowed to do this in the system or not? This is a picture of Bud on my driveway. It's one of his favorite places in my house because the dogs can't get there. It's also sunny for him. There's a tree stump there that he can sharpen his claws on, and if he's feeling particularly adventurous, there's little lizards that he can hunt. He doesn't ever do that because he's lazy. But in the driveway, he's very affectionate with people, especially if you're going up the driveway. So if you're going to go take the rubbish out, or if you're going to go get the post, he'll walk up with you and rub himself against your leg as you go in. Very cute. Until you get to the top, and then something happens in his brain, and he realizes, oh shit, you're actually coming back into the house as well. Oh no. So you take the dustbin up, or you go and you get the letters, and you turn around, and then there's this little cat there, and you have to lock eyes with him because you have to fake him out. As soon as you start walking back down the driveway, he will attack. He will try and bite you. He will claw at your ankles. He doesn't want to authorize you to come back into the house. He's very happy for you to go. I imagine in his mind he's going, I'll miss you so much. And then as soon as you turn around and come back, he's angry. In messaging systems, there's two things we need to authorize. The first is sending commands. So who is allowed to send this command? Are they authorized to be able to tell me to charge a customer's credit card, for instance? So commands go to a specific location, but they can come from multiple locations. That's the one thing we need to authorize. The second thing is events. Who is allowed to receive a copy of this event? So events come from a single location. Example, this customer's credit card has been charged, and they can go to multiple locations. Now, I'm going to quickly simplify our diagram a little bit because we don't need all of the stuff. So I'm going to get rid of the API gateway to save a bit of space. We're going to get rid of some of the other modules. They're still there. I'm just not going to show them because I want a slightly smaller picture for us. So let's have a look at how we authorize who can send a command. So in the happy path, module A will create a message and say, well, I need to charge customers credit card 500 Rand. The message goes to the mediator bus. The mediator bus says, oh, this is handled by module C, which is out of process. So I'm going to take the message, I'm going to serialize it and put it on the message broker, and the message broker will then route it through to module C. This is how it's supposed to work. But for the first part of Zero Trust in this talk, we need to assume that somebody is out there trying to ruin our day. Not only that, but they've got access to our message broker somehow. We don't necessarily know how. Maybe a junior developer committed the connection string. We didn't see it in the pull request because they got rid of it in the next commit, but it's still in their history, right? Or maybe it's a disgruntled employee who's trying to do something to your system. Or maybe it is actually hackers in hoodies who are just really good at hacking your system. Somehow, somebody has got access to your message broker. If they've got access to your message broker, they can go and put a message on the queue. So they can create a message that says, charge William's credit card minus 50,000 Rand. That message goes on the broker and gets to Module C's inbox, and Module C says, okay, I'll do that. How do we prevent this? Thankfully, this is easy, surprisingly so. We use asymmetric key cryptography. So when module A generates the message, it must also sign the message with its private key. It includes the signature on the message, sends the message along, the message goes to module C, and module C can use module A's public key to validate that the signature is correct. So module C is able to say, okay, this message came from module A, and module A is allowed to tell me to charge credit cards, and I can validate that that signature matches. Daniel will never be able to generate a signature that's going to match module A's because Daniel doesn't have access to module A's private key. And so if we get a message on the queue and we look at the signature and the signature doesn't match one of our known entities that are allowed to send those messages, we can discard it. Now, you don't necessarily want to do this in all of your modules because you don't necessarily know how many modules you're going to have in your system in a year's time, 5 years' time. So what you want is when you send a message, you want the mediator bus, the implementation that you're using of the mediator pattern to be able to do that. At this point, when you send a message on the mediator bus can say, oh, this message is going to module B, which is still in process. I don't need to sign it because I'm just invoking an in-memory call. It's a lot harder for somebody to put messages on an in-memory queue. So if it's in process, you don't have to sign the message. If it is going onto the broker, then the mediator bus should use the sender's private key to sign the message, put it on the message broker. Conversely, the same must also happen. When a message comes off of the message broker, the mediator implementation needs to be able to look at that signature and validate that this comes from somebody who's allowed to do this. So the implementation of the mediator pattern is where all of this should belong. You can do it in the modules, but probably not. If you're in the .NET space, maybe you've used the mediator NuGet package by Jimmy Bogard. You might just use something like this, where you take the message, sign it, and then add it as a header. It doesn't matter what tool you use to implement your mediator pattern, as long as you can do this pipeline behavior. You can inject properties in the message before it gets sent or before you invoke code as it's received. If you do that, we're quite capable then to say no to messages that we don't need to honor. And cats are surprisingly good at saying no to things. They take great pleasure out of it. There's got to be like an evolutionary advantage. But if you sign outgoing messages using your private key, it means that people can validate that those messages came from you when they receive them. So that's stopping people from sending commands if they're not supposed to have access to. How do we stop them from reading messages or events that get published? This is another one of Butt's favorite rooms in the house, particularly in winter because it's sunny. It's next to my daughter's bookcase, and she likes to say that he's obviously reading her books while she's at school. Clearly he's not, because he's an illiterate idiot. He's also super lazy, so even if he could read, he wouldn't. So in the happy path, the way it's supposed to work is module A publishes an event, and the event is customer's address has been updated. It goes to the mediator bus says, oh, module C is interested in this event, so I'm going to take that message, put it on the broker, and it's going to go to module C. Everything's happy. Except we've got Daniel. who's got access to our message broker. If you've got access to to a message broker, you've got the connection string, it means that you can, if you're in Azure, set up a subscription to a topic and also get a copy of all the messages that are sent to that topic. How do we stop this from happening? Again, this one is thankfully easy. We just use asymmetric key cryptography in reverse. So when module A creates the message and it says this message needs to go to whoever, and it publishes this event, it goes to the mediator bus. Oh, sorry. If we don't do anything, it might end up in Daniel's inbox. But if we do want to do something, when we get the message in the mediator bus, we look at that message and say, oh, okay, so this message is supposed to go to module C. I can use module C's public key to encrypt the message. So if you encrypt the message using the destination's public key, when the message gets to the destination, that destination can decrypt the message using its private key. So if a copy of this encrypted message does end up in Daniel's inbox, he doesn't have access to module C's private key, so he can't decrypt this message. And thereby, we can prevent people from reading messages they're not supposed to have access to. Again, if you're using Mediator, you might do something like this. The code isn't actually that important. You just need the ability to replace the body of the message with an encrypted version of that message before you send it off. So no matter what implementation of the Mediator pattern you choose, as long as you can do that, you should be fine. And if you do that, you can prevent people from reading messages that they're not supposed to have access to reading entirely. The key thing here is you need to assume that there's a bad actor already within your system, and they're able to access your resources that should be secure. Now, I said there were two things we have to protect when it comes to authorizing messages. I lied. There's a third, and that's discarding messages. The cats are really good at just discarding things, right? They're particularly good at it in some cases. They just like being destructive little balls of fur for whatever reason. And the same thing can happen in our systems. So if it's a messaging-based system, when you send a message, it should end up at the destination. That should be the happy path. However, we could have someone who wants to be malicious, and maybe they can't put bad messages onto our broker, or maybe they can't read the copies of the messages that we get. But if they have access to our message broker, instead of setting up a subscription to a topic, they can instead just consume messages from a queue. This is very helpful in distributed systems because it's the competing consumers pattern. Great. But if somebody's using this, when a message gets sent, if it ends up in Daniel's inbox, he can just discard that message, and we've lost it. But that's particularly bad if the messages involving money, for instance. How do we fix this? I'd like to say there's an easy answer here, like using cryptography, but there isn't. If somebody has got access to connect to your broker, they can take messages and discard them, and there's not much you can do to stop them. What we can do, though, is we can reduce the window that this is a problem by rotating our security credentials frequently. So this is a screenshot of the documentation from HashiCorp Vault, and what they've got is a concept of dynamic credentials, where if you want to connect to RabbitMQ, for instance, you don't load the connection string from an environment variable somewhere. You request credentials from HashiCorp Vault. In the background, HashiCorp Vault will go and create a new user, create a new password, then return that to your code. Your code then uses those credentials to connect to the broker. After 7 days from their documentation, HashiCorp Vault will automatically go and deactivate that user. 7 days is a long time, though, and that's just a default. Instead of 7 days, you can make the credentials valid for 1 day. Instead of a day, you can have it for a few hours. You can go all the way down to a few minutes for these credentials, for these dynamic credentials within HashiCorp Vault, if you need to. I'm not going to stand here and tell you all to use HashiCorp Vault because it's quite an expensive product. It is super cool, but no. The idea here is what's important. The idea is interesting, and you can do the same thing yourself. For instance, if you need to create a user in RabbitMQ, just make 2 requests to the management API. This is, of course, 2 HTTP calls, which can be quite slow, so we can get clever with this. We can, instead of creating a new user every time, we can have a pool of users that have got random passwords. Then when somebody requests credentials, we just have to change that user's password and then return that. Or we can have a pool of users that are constantly rotating their usernames and passwords, and we know what some of them are, but they're only valid for a few minutes at a time. So when someone requests, we've already got a user that's provisioned that we can send back. RabbitMQ, this could work quite well. You don't want to do the same thing for something like Azure or SQS, because provisioning a user takes minutes sometimes, and that's if you're really lucky. So for something like Azure, what you might want to do is use SAS token, where the token is only valid for a minute, and this is an incredibly quick operation. So you can use this to generate tokens that then your code uses to access those resources. And if it's only valid for a minute, it means that if somebody does have access to that information or that token, they can only do something with it for that minute. You can do similar things in SQS, whatever it is. The idea here is to use dynamic credentials that are only valid for a certain period of time and rotate that time or rotate those credentials frequently. Let's look at personalization. So personalization is a third aspect of security that's often overlooked. You've got authentication, I am William. Authorization, William is allowed to do this. Personalization, William is allowed to do this, but only this portion of it. An example might be, I'm allowed to see all of the transactions that have taken place over the last week, but I'm not allowed to see the RAND value. Robert is allowed to see the RAND value, but not William. So you personalize in the data that gets sent. And this is important in messaging systems because when you publish an event, even if somebody is supposed to get access to that event, they don't necessarily need to have access to all the information in that event. We've got Poppy in South Africa, which means that if we have personal identifiable information, we need to make sure that only people that have got a legitimate interest in that data are able to get a copy of that data. If everybody gets a copy of the customer's address, contact number, email address, and their name, that's a violation of Poppy because not everybody should have access to that. And the problem with messaging systems is you don't know who's going to subscribe to these events when you publish the message. Today, when you're developing your system, you might know where it's going to go, but in 3 years' time, you don't know how many other subscribers there are going to be. They should get a copy of the order shipped event, but maybe they shouldn't get access to all the information in the event. One technique we can use is we can decorate these properties with attributes that says these attributes are sensitive. So we need to make sure that only people that are able to read this information can get it. Anybody can subscribe to the order shipped event, but only people that have got access to the key to decrypt these properties are able to read that. Again, in our mediator implementation, what we would do is we would replace the properties with encrypted versions of those properties, which means that when we receive the code, when we receive the message, we then are able to look at that sensitive information and decrypt those properties. If we don't have access to the key to decrypt those properties, we then don't see that the property values. But we still know that an order has been shipped. With attributes, you can do things like user role. So you can say only people in the dispatch role should have access to this information. Or people in the customer services role should be able to see the person's email address. By using these attributes, you can then determine which key to use to encrypt the message and then which key to use to decrypt those parts of the message. So you can make sensitive data readable only by those people that have got access to it. So even if everybody should have access to the order shipped event, only parts of it are readable by people that have got access to those specific keys. By doing that, only people that know how to use a tap are able to drink water from the tap. Let's look at token expiration. So Butterbean likes getting his belly rubbed, but only for a certain window of time. You don't know what that window is. So he'll present his belly to you, say, come on, give me a scratch. And if you don't get the timing just right, if you put your hand in there and you've missed the window, he grips onto you and with his front claws, and his back claws, he rakes your arm, trying to get the insides of your body to be on the outsides of your body, which is generally a problem because the inside of my body is where I keep all my blood and stuff. So you need to act before the token, before the offer expires. In messaging systems, when you send a message, Module A says, I want to charge a customer's credit card 500 Rand. That message goes to Module C, and everybody's happy. Except there might be messages already in the queue. Heck, there might be lots of messages already in the queue. You don't know how long it's going to be from the time when you send the message to when it's going to get processed. So if you put the message in the queue and you wait for it to get processed, especially if you're using the token of the user, that token could expire. And if it's expired, when the message gets to the front of the queue, what do? Do we honor that message? Do we still do whatever the user requested us to do at that point? I mean, the answer is always, it depends, right? We're going to look at 3 ways of dealing with token expiry in this talk. The first is forwarding identity. Then we're going to take a look at using a custom data structure, and then we'll use token exchanges and see what the differences are between each of these different approaches. Forwarding identity is where when the user presents their token to the system, as we generate a message, instead of including the token on the message, we instead just include the user ID on the message. So we've just taken the identity of the user and forwarding it along. This works very well in most cases. However, if we've got a Daniel, they can create a message and say that this message was generated by Bob, not Daniel, it was definitely Bob that sent this message. They can create fake users and associate the messages with those users. So maybe this isn't always sufficient. We can also use a custom data structure to prevent people tampering with it. So a custom data structure is where, as we send the message, instead of just the user identity, we include an object that represents a little bit more about the user. Maybe we'll include their user identity as well as the claims that they've got, and we'll also include a hash of this object so that nobody can go and tamper with it, and they can't go and create a new user identity for us. This is an improvement on just the user ID, because now the hash means we can validate that the state of the user when the message was sent wasn't tampered with. However, Daniel can still intercept a message and take a copy of that data structure and stick it on another message. So again, this might not be sufficient depending on your environment. What about token exchange? So a token exchange relies off of a couple things. The first assumption is that people that are accessing your system are coming from a less trusted environment. Once they're within your system boundary, you can be a bit more lax with some of the trust that you've got. So when you generate a message, you've got the user's token and you want to apply it to the message. Instead of applying the user's token to the message, you instead say, I'm not going to use the user's token, I'm going to use module A's token. So each of your modules will have their own tokens as well. So module A is about to send the message. It validates that the user's token is valid and it hasn't expired as it's about to send the message. It then says, well, I'm going to, instead of using the user's token, I'm going to put my token on it. This means I've already validated the user was allowed to do this operation at that point in time. And then when I send the message, I'm going to include my token. The requirements here are that the internal tokens must have a longer expiry than the external tokens. They must include a hash of the entire message so that the message can't be tampered with. And it must include the message ID in the hash. This is so that somebody can't copy and paste the message on the same queue, because if you do that, the native message ID will change, which means the hash changes. So you're then able to prevent people from copying and pasting and duplicating messages on your queue. It can also be a refresh token. So a refresh token is a URL that when you provide it with the expired token, it then goes and validates whether or not a new token should be generated. If it is, then it returns that back to you. So you can use refresh tokens for this as well. But as soon as you're using messaging in your systems, you need to be aware that tokens can expire before the message gets processed. There's no guarantee that a message will get processed within a day, within a week, within a year, especially if you've got dead letter queue management. There might be a message sitting in your dead letter queue for months on end while you're fixing whatever bug related to causing that failure. Once you've fixed that failure, that message needs to get played back into production. But if the token has expired, do you still honor it? So you need to think about these strategies for systems, so that when your systems eventually do start coming back online and they are able to respond to whatever you're trying to trigger in your system, that they're able to do this. This is also a representation of the performance of my code that I write. What about when things change? So when we got Butterbean, he was a single cat. He loved it. We've got dogs since then. I'm no longer able to grow hair on my head. We've had children. One of those things was a blessing for Butterbean. The rest, not so much. He's a miserable, grumpy cat. But life has changed. So how do we version security requirements in our system? Because security could also change in your system. For instance, if we send a message, ends up in Module C takes the message and processes it, everything's happy. However, we might then say, well, we want to change the security of the message. So we're going to deploy a new version of our modular monolith, and this new version is going to have a change to the message. So rather than charge credit card being like this, we might then say, well, the credit card number is sensitive. We've changed the schema of the message that we're sending. If module A sends this message and it goes to module C doesn't know that the schema has changed. Well, that's easy. What we can do is we can deploy module A and module C together, right? Deploy them both at the same time and everything's fine. Module C will then know about the new version. And that's true, except there might be other messages in the queue that are still using the old format. And when that message gets to the front of the queue, we need to be able to deal with both the old and the new format. Otherwise, something's going to fail. In our implementation of the mediator pattern, what we need to do is we need to get away from an idea of using a key or even a couple keys. What we need is when we send a message, when we put a message on the queue and we have some sort of key that's been used in the generation of that message, we need to include the ID of the key that was used for that message. So we send a message and we say, this message was encrypted using key ID 1234. That means that when we take the message off of the queue, we can go to a key management service and request key ID 1234. If we've got access to key 1234, we'll get it. If we don't, we'll get a failure on the request, which means that all of the requirements around who can access what key can sit behind our key management service, whether that's KMS in Azure, AWS, or whether it's a Key Vault in Azure, or HashiCorp Vault. A key management service means that you can rotate these keys incredibly quickly. In fact, you can take it further. Every message you send can use a new key. And if you're using a new key for everything that you send, it means it's really hard for somebody to be able to intercept that key and do anything with it. But if you're rotating these keys frequently enough that a key being leaked isn't a concern, you're winning. So as long as your middleware can select different keys and decrypt messages and encrypt messages using different keys and specify which keys were used, it means that all of the access around key management can be extracted to your key vault if you're using them. So we've taken a look at 6 things in this talk. The first is forward and identity. And again, this is the only one that I recommend we do, even if we're never, ever going to scale our system out. Just include identity as part of your message, because it makes it more explicit about what your message is doing. If you need to, you can sign messages to make sure that only people that are able to send those messages are the people that are sending the messages. On the other side, you can encrypt messages if you need to make sure that people aren't able to read messages they don't have access to. If you don't have to go that far, partial encryption is a great way to do personalization of messages. Everyone can get a copy of this message, but only the people that have got access to the sensitive information can read it. If you're using messaging in your system, you have to plan for token expiration. It doesn't have to be a sophisticated solution, but you do have to think about it up front because it will happen. You will have tokens that expire, and you need to know whether or not you're going to honor those messages. And then use a key vault because it makes a lot of the stuff substantially easier. Now, I'm not saying you have to go and implement all of these in your system, except for the first one, because these all have a cost associated with them. Development time is expensive. Implementation time is expensive. Doing things like signing and decrypting messages is computationally expensive. So you need to evaluate whether or not the cost of implementing these solutions is worth the benefit that you're going to get out of it. If you do that, you'll also have a cute little toy that you can keep just a little bit more secure than it was when you started on the system. Now, originally this talk was going to be all cat memes all the way because they're objectively hilarious. But unfortunately, while I was preparing this talk, Butter Bean passed away. So I thought, what better way to honor his memory than to stand up in front of a room full of people that didn't know him and spend 45 minutes telling them what an asshole he was. If you do have a cat back home, please tell them I say pss, 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 pss. Or if you've got a dog or anything else, give them some extra affection from me, and I hope you enjoy this talk. Thank you.